Welcome to the deep dive. We take a close look at what's really going on beneath the surface of some pretty complex issues.
That's right.
Today, we're diving into the latest developments in the Russia-Ukraine situation. It's, well, constantly evolving.
Always.
We've gathered a set of recent news reports looking at proposed ceasefires, some diplomatic talks involving the U.S., France, Russia.
And crucially, Ukraine's perspective in all this.
Exactly. So our mission here is to, cut through the noise, get past the headlines, and give you a clear picture of where things stand right now.
Highlighting the key sticking points, potential ways forward.
But also acknowledging, look, this is incredibly complex and there's a lot of uncertainty involved. Okay, let's get into it.
Right. So I think the first thing that really jumps out is Putin's announcement about a possible 72-hour ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
Time for May 8th to 10th, which marks the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II.
Okay.
And significantly, Moscow has called on Kyiv to, well, do the same, to reciprocate.
Which, on the surface, that sounds like a positive step, maybe some de-escalation.
It could seem that way.
But there's a definite sense of caution, right? I mean, the Kremlin statement also included a warning.
Yes, about an adequate and effective response if Ukraine violates it.
And it's hard not to remember that earlier unilateral ceasefire Putin announced, the one about energy infrastructure.
Which didn't really hold, no.
Exactly. So that history, it kind of hangs over this new proposal, makes you question how reliable it is.
It inevitably does, yeah.
Yeah.
This pattern, it colors how we see this new announcement. And you have to remember the timing, too.
What about the timing?
Well, this comes during a period of pretty intense military activity.
Yeah.
Both sides have been carrying out long-range strikes recently.
Right, using sophisticated missiles, drones.
Precisely. It underscores the ongoing intensity. For instance, the Russian Defense Ministry just reported intercepting a lot of Ukrainian drones overnight, especially near the Bryansk border region.
And on the Ukrainian side, a stark reminder is this morning, Monday morning air raid sirens across the country. Now, thankfully, no immediate reports of casualties or damage this time, but it just shows that constant threat. Okay, let's shift gears a bit, talk about the U.S. Their involvement seems to be at a critical point.
It really does. You have President Trump, who's consistently said he wants a swift end to the fighting.
But how to get there? That seems like the big question, given all the mistrust and the completely different stories coming from each side.
Exactly. And that path is really murky right now.
Yeah, and it almost feels like the window for the current level of U.S. engagement might be closing. Secretary of State Rubio called this week very critical for the U.S. deciding on its continued involvement.
That's a strong statement.
It is. He stressed how vital American military aid has been for Ukraine and, hinted that future aid might depend on a shift in the U.S. approach.
Which raises huge questions about Ukraine's ability to sustain its defense without that consistent, large-scale American support.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, or maybe confusing, is the messaging. Trump said on Friday a settlement felt close.
Right. I saw that.
But then he also voiced doubts about Putin's sincerity. He pointed to ongoing Russian strikes hitting civilian areas, even while these talks are supposedly happening.
That duality is fascinating. It really highlights the complex, maybe even shifting dynamics within the U.S. strategy itself.
It really does. And adding another piece to this diplomatic puzzle, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary Rubio had a phone call.
Okay.
The Russian readout of that call emphasized, quote, consolidating the emerging prerequisites for starting negotiations.
Sounds hopeful. Ish,
yeah. Because, on the other hand, Russia effectively shot down a U.S. proposal for an immediate full 30-day ceasefire.
How so?
By tacking on conditions Ukraine couldn't accept, whereas Ukraine had accepted the initial U.S. proposal.
Ah, okay. So that contrast is pretty stark. It's not just about tactics. It suggests maybe fundamental disagreements on what peace even looks like.
Totally. Russia's conditions seem aimed at locking in territorial gains, while Ukraine's acceptance suggests they just want the fighting to stop, but not by giving up land.
Which brings us to the European perspective. How are allies seeing this? Well, reportedly, Western European officials are accusing the Kremlin of deliberately stalling peace talks.
Stalling? Why?
The thinking is, it gives Russian forces more time to grab more territory. There's a real concern that Russia's putting land gains ahead of actual negotiation.
And kind of backing that up, a French diplomatic official mentioned an agreement between Trump, Zelensky, and Macron.
An agreement on what?
To work together in the coming days to get to a solid ceasefire. The French see that truce as essential, like a first step before any real peace talks can happen.
A precondition, essentially.
Exactly, a precondition for talks that respect Ukraine's interests, and Europe's interests too, suggests some coordinated Western effort there.
So we have this proposed ceasefire. We have the international reactions. Let's focus now on Ukraine's position in all this.
Yeah, crucial piece.
They've been incredibly consistent, really reluctant to give up any land to Russia just to get peace.
Even with hints from Washington that maybe some concessions might be necessary down the line.
Even then. And you can understand why from a national sovereignty perspective, but it does create a major hurdle for any negotiated settlement that involves changing borders.
It absolutely does. For Ukraine, territorial integrity is just non-negotiable.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. This conflict isn't happening in a vacuum, right? The wider international context plays a huge role.
A massive role. I mean, the starting point is Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022. That fact alone complicates everything.
Definitely.
And then you have Putin openly admitting that North Korea is sending support troops, artillery ammo.
Right, which just shows this complex web of international relationships and how involved other countries are getting.
And it's not just North Korea. There are reports about Iran supplying Shahed drones.
Which we've seen used extensively. Yes. And China selling machinery and microelectronics to Russia, things that can be used potentially in weapons manufacturing.
And on the other side, the U.S. and Europe are still Kyiv's biggest backers. So with all these international players involved, does Ukraine have any specific leverage in these talks? Anything they can bring to the table?
That's a key question. One potential area is the progress being made on a mineral agreement with the United States.
A mineral agreement. Tell me more.
Ukraine has significant reserves of critical minerals, lithium, titanium, things like that. This agreement would give the U.S. access.
Interesting. And how does past aid factor in? Because the U.S. has given a lot.
Crucially, it's been confirmed that all the American aid provided so far won't be counted against Ukraine in the terms of this mineral deal. That's a positive signal for Kyiv.
Okay, that's significant. And Ukraine's Prime Minister, Shmyhal, he's been clear about their conditions for this deal, right? Their red lines.
Yes, absolutely. He outlined them very clearly. Things like it has to comply with Ukraine's constitution, its laws, its commitments to Europe.
And needs parliamentary sign-off.
Exactly. It shows Ukraine is being very careful, very strategic, making sure any deal fits within their legal and strategic framework, even while they're fighting a war.
Yeah, that careful, principled approach really underscores their strategic thinking, their determination to control their own resources.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. We have this proposed ceasefire, but honestly, there's a lot of skepticism around it. Past broken promises, ongoing fighting. It makes it hard to trust.
Very hard.
Diplomatic efforts are happening involving the U.S., Europe, Russia, Ukraine, but huge disagreements remain, especially over territory. That seems to be the biggest sticking point.
Fundamentally, yes.
And the whole thing is layered with complexity because of all the other countries involved, backing different sides.
Making any resolution incredibly difficult.
Meanwhile, Ukraine is trying to find leverage, maybe through this mineral deal with the U.S., but they're standing firm on their core principles for any kind of settlement.
Which leads us to, I suppose, the big question for you, the listener, to think about.
Go on.
Given these really entrenched positions, all this history of mistrust, can a temporary ceasefire, like the one proposed, actually pave the way for lasting peace?
Or is it just, a tactical pause, a breather in a conflict that's set to drag on much longer?
Exactly. And maybe more fundamentally, what kind of shifts in thinking, what fundamental changes in perspective would actually be needed from everyone involved to get beyond this stalemate and find a way towards something more sustainable?
Yeah. Big questions. Definitely something to chew on.